Welcome to Dealer Driven, where the rubber meets the road to success. This episode sponsored by Kerrigan Advisors.
Kerrigan Advisors is auto retail's only exclusive sell-side advisor. We do not employ a brokerage model or have a listing service. Rather, our team actively manages each client's sale process from beginning to success. Other firms have conflicts, we have your interests.
Welcome to Dealer Driven. I'm Michael Hayes.
And I'm Camron Wilson. Today we're excited to start our first quarterly economic report.
We'll be reviewing how the U.S. light vehicle market performed in Q2 and looking ahead at what could be in store for Q3, everything from sales trends and inventory shifts to economic headwinds and more. And we certainly know there's a lot going on.
A lot more. And to guide us through all of it, we're joined by a trusted voice in the industry, Patrick Manzi, Chief Economist at the National Automobile Dealers Association, and he'll break down the data, connect the dots, and offer his expert insights into what dealers, automakers, and consumers might expect in the months ahead.
Let's get started.
Patrick, welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Patrick, before we dive into the numbers, and we know we have lots of those, can you give our listeners a quick reminder of the key economic forces that were at play going into Q2 of this year?
Sure. The consumer was in a relatively strong position. We had seen steady gains in real disposable income and consumer spending in the months coming out of Q1 and into Q2. So they were poised and ready to go out there, spend money on some vehicles. We saw, very strong SARs in March and April as consumers pulled ahead some of their purchases. And, looking ahead to the rest of the year, I think it's kind of the best times for 25 are behind us. There will be some challenges in the back half of the year.
So let's talk about the Q2 market performance. From your vantage point, what are some of the standout trends that you saw in the light vehicle market over the last quarter?
Well, affordability has been the story of the industry. It's sort of an evergreen story of the industry, but with high interest rates, record high transaction prices, and declining incentives throughout the quarter, we continued to see consumers flocking for more affordable options, strong sales in the small car segment, strong sales in the small CUV and mid-size CUV segments. So, some significant gains there. And, consumers actually, I believe, are still maybe accepting a smaller vehicle than they otherwise would have because they're very conscious of payment in this environment. And right now, payments are hovering almost just around $750 a month for the average vehicle. Some people are paying way more than that as well. So it is a big expense. And there are other pressures out there that may limit consumers' ability to spend on just the vehicle itself.
Well, I know that this is probably the question that everybody's waiting for as it relates to an economic update. As we all know, every other headline right now is talking about tariffs. How are they affecting dealerships?
Well, I mentioned March and April sales. March's SAR was the highest we have seen since April of 2021. And if you go back then, everybody was just getting vaccinated. They had a lot of money in their pockets. Interest rates were at historical lows. So people were willing and really ready to go out and spend money on new vehicles. We saw a killer SAR then. This time, it was consumers going out and trying to make purchases before the tariffs announced by President Trump took effect. And so that pulled ahead a lot of volume. J.D. Power estimated that over 170,000 additional sales occurred in March and April as consumers rushed to beat tariffs. And now when we got to June, we are starting to see the payback for some of those pull-ahead volume. June came in at around a 15.3 million unit SAR. If you had asked me at the start of the year what a June would look like, it'd probably be in the low 16 million units. And that's kind of what the SAR is going to look like for the rest of the year. Low 15 million, maybe high 14 million unit SARs, as largely production volumes have fallen. We are expecting that the consumer is going to pull back a little bit as well. OEMs have already pulled back on incentive spending. And a lot of these actions are taking place because people are just kind of waiting to see where does this tariff environment ultimately land? What will be the final rates? How will prices change before they might want to go out and make another big purchase. In fact, just before taping today, a couple of hours ago, we saw another significant announcement about tariffs. We are still working internally to figure out, will these be stacked with the existing auto tariffs? Will they be independent of that? So in this landscape of uncertainty, people are looking and wanting certainty. And I do think that's going to limit the sales pace somewhat in the back half of the year.
I don't know, tariffs kind of seem like the weather in Vermont. Just wait a few hours and we'll see if something changes, But and you've kind of already alluded to this a little bit, Patrick. And I realize it's different for different OEMs, but how did inventory levels shift from into Q2? And you've kind of alluded to some of what are the other story behind the changes in inventory levels?
Yeah, so April was the first year-over-year decline in inventory going back to the heart of the chip shortage. That also took place, I believe, in May and in June. Inventory right now is about 2.6 million or so units out there on the ground and in transit. And just for reference, before the pandemic, we averaged about 3.8 million units on the ground at any given time. So still well below where we were before the pandemic. And this cycle high, we touched 2.9 million or so back in November of 24. So the outlook for the rest of the year is that inventory continues to drain throughout the summer, maybe bottoming out around 2.25 million. But we're likely going to end the year somewhere right around where we are today at about 2.5 million units on the ground and in transit. So OEMs had already begun to slow production a little bit towards the end of last year. They had promised discipline, and it appears they were taking the steps to do that. But now with tariffs, that is limiting production further. OEMs are working out new ways to build or allocate some production to existing capacity here in the US. And then we're seeing, lines still shuttered in Canada, Mexico, and in other countries around the world as the OEMs continue to work on the tariff environment. The headline story, though, for North American production is that we're looking at reductions in production from 900,000, maybe 1 million units compared to our expectations at the start of the year. And if you want to talk about OEMs specifically, if you look at all the, sort of the big players, most of them are going to see their North American production fall. There are a few notable exceptions here. The Hyundai Group is actually going to see production rise a little bit. They've made significant commitments to building more here in the U.S. And the other OEM that stands out a little bit here is Tesla. They are planning to produce more vehicles this year. But for the most part, everybody else is going to trim production. And, when production falls, inventory falls. And we've already seen as inventory has been dropping in the past few months, OEMs have cut back on incentive spending. The two move very closely together. And just as we saw incentives rise as inventory was building coming out of the chip shortage, now that it's starting to fall, incentives are going to fall. And that's going to be, kind of another headwind for new light vehicle sales in the back half of the year.
Once, if I may, real quickly, Cameron, on that, what I'd like to remind dealers, though, is having lower inventory levels isn't always a bad thing, as long as we still have sales, of course.
You're right. I'm sure every dealer who's watching this remembers what it was like 3 years ago. You don't have to discount as much to move your available inventory when it's tight.
And comparing it to 2019 before COVID, too. Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, Patrick, you mentioned incentive spending probably decreasing. And I know there's been a lot of talk about the EV tax credits and, where that's going to end up. Did the second quarter show any notable changes in consumer demand for EVs, hybrids, or traditional gas-powered vehicles? What's happening in that?
So EV sales through the first half of the year compared to the first half of last year, they're up about 5%. So growth hasn't completely stalled out, but in terms of market share, it has. We're still hovering in that low 7% range for battery electric vehicle market share. Plug-in hybrids, not much change, around 2% market share. The real story is in conventional hybrid, where sales are up 40% year over year, and market share is climbing each month. Right now, it's about, I want to say in the ballpark of 12.5%. And that seems to be the sweet spot for the customer right now. They can't get enough of these vehicles. They're in short supply. And finally, after, decades of products that couldn't match their ICE counterparts, well, now, in many cases, they beat the ICE counterpart in terms of power and performance Oh, and not to mention, they get probably 5 to 10 mpg better fuel economy than a lot of their ICE counterparts. So consumers are really recognizing that value and are shopping heavily in that segment.
Kerrigan Advisors is honored to be the leading sell-side advisor to auto dealers nationwide. Our professional and proven sale process has earned our clients over $9 billion. Our team is always available to be a confidential thought partner as you decide the future of your business.
You mentioned affordability earlier. In fact, I'm still thinking, I know I'm kind of old, but $750 was more than my first mortgage payment. Okay. Let's talk about that affordability. You said that was the average payment in Q2. So thinking about the affordability as far as pricing trends, both new and used and monthly payments, how did it change from Q1 to Q2?
Really, on the new side and the used side, we haven't seen too much movement this year. It's been maybe between 740 and 750 on new, and then used is right around 550 or so. It's the same for interest rates too. The average new rate is around 7%, and the average used rate is between 10 and 11%. And that's been true over the past year. You did, kind of hit on used. And so I thought maybe I can mention a little bit about expectations for used, if that sounds good. Looking ahead, I'm right here saying lower inventory on the new side, and we have an affordability issue on the new side. These tariffs have sort of turbocharged some of these price increases that were happening gradually year over year. And we are expecting, there have been announcements from some OEMs, but we are expecting really to see price increases from all OEMs over the next several months. And so when you raise the price of a new vehicle, those entry-level buyers now become used vehicle buyers, right? And so we're going to see more demand for these late model used vehicles at a time when off-lease volumes are, hovering around record lows. If you go back 3 years ago, we were in the heart of the chip shortage. OEMs realized, hey, we don't have to subsidize these leases at all. And so leasing penetration fell dramatically. It was basically cut in half. And now we are sort of hitting the bottom of that off-lease trough. And it's actually going to bottom in Q4, but off-lease volumes will remain low throughout most of 2026. And so that's going to go ahead and pull up some of the values of older vehicles as well. If it's tough to find those late models, well, now you start looking at 4 to 6 year olds. And then going ahead, we can expect to see, used wholesale values rising. We've just seen a little bit if you look at some of the big market-wide indices, but talking with dealers, I'm hearing prices are up in the lanes. And so it's only a matter of time before that translates into retail. So I would expect that we do see retail prices for used vehicles at franchise dealers pick up a bit in the back half of the year.
I was just reading a report on that real quick that was saying that the average price of a 3-year-old car last quarter was $32,000, a 3-year-old car. In 2019, like 60% of those were under $20,000. So to make your point about how that's changing, especially on the 3-year-old car because of the lack of them around. Thank you.
You're right. I mean, that's not too much difference than the new car transaction price back in 2019. I think it was maybe $4 or $5 grand higher than that.
So, Patrick, obviously you've already talked about price and tariffs. Looking ahead into Q3, are there any other major tailwinds or headwinds that dealers should be on the lookout that could affect sales volume?
Well, I mentioned consumer hesitancy. We're expecting that GDP growth is going to come in lower than we had expected at the start of the year as a result of the tariffs. Some headwinds that are auto related that could affect your customers are the increasing prices for motor vehicle insurance and rising prices for motor vehicle maintenance and repair. So I think auto insurance is up about 55% if you compare it to just before the pandemic started. Consumers are really feeling that. I have personal experience with it. I like to shop my policies regularly. There's no relief in sight. I call it a lot of places and they just said, hey, prices are up across the board. So that is going to limit their budgets as well. I am expecting to see overall inflation to pick up in the second half of the year too. Now, I'm not talking about rising up to 9% like we saw back in 22, but 3.5% to 4%, we could see the CPI rise too. And so that's going to impact consumers' ability to spend as well. So those are some of the headwinds. The tailwinds, we did just pass this bill. I know it's not going to happen immediately, but sometimes consumers expecting to have a little bit money back from lower taxes may cause them to go out and spend a little more in the present. But, there certainly will be pockets of the income distribution that get a healthy tax cut. And those are people who are probably going to be new vehicle customers. So that could be a nice tailwind for the industry. But in general, still, we're looking at a forecast of about 15.3 million units for new light vehicle sales for all of the year. And that's about 900,000 or so lower than we were at from the start of the year. So the tariffs will have an impact on sales by the time we get to the end of the year.
So as an economist and thinking about tariffs and everything else, and thanks for sharing that stuff, how do you forecast tariffs if we're not going to be and how it happens, not only affecting vehicles, but affecting, as you mentioned, about repairs and parts and everything else? How do you account for that potential effect of what may or may not happen in the next quarter?
One of the things we're looking at is vehicle production. And when you see that production plans are being cut, well, there'll be fewer vehicles available to sell. So that's, one part of the equation where you can go, okay, well, we'll roll the forecast back simply because the inventory won't necessarily be there to hit your initial sales target. So that's one part of it. And then you assume that there will be some impact to consumers' budgets because of inflation from the tariffs. And all of this stuff, basically I just throw it into a big pot and stir it up, take a sip of it. And that's how I come up with the numbers. But really, it is just a lot of reading, trying to, figure out exactly trying to figure out what I kind of think is going to happen. And, I read people who are a lot smarter than me and try to absorb their opinions as well. So all of that comes together to spit out a 15.3 number. I promise you it's not just pulled from thin air. I am thinking about this a lot and trying to take in as much as I can.
So, Patrick, with all the talk about consumer sentiment and macro pressures, was there anything unexpected, data points or trends from quarter two that surprised you?
I will say June's forecast was for 15 million SAR. It came in 15.3. So it came in a little better than most of us were expecting. So the American consumer continues to be resilient. And I would love to be proved wrong with these expectations about sales and impacts to production. I would love to be proved wrong here because it would mean, a better year for the auto industry, a better year for our dealers, and more fleet turnover, which is, always a good thing here in the industry. But yeah, it came in a little better than expected in June. And so let's hope we're all undershooting it and we end up with a better than expected year.
So, Patrick, what we always like to do is leave our listeners with one key takeaway, okay? So what piece of advice might you offer to dealers as they are into just gearing up into Q3 right now with what you think might happen?
Well, I suspect they've already done this, but dust off the COVID playbook when it comes to acquiring your used inventory. I think that's going to be a really key tool to have, and just figuring out how to get cars. I think most of the "we'll buy your car" signs have come down around the office. Maybe you guys, or maybe I just don't notice them anymore. But, all of those tools that you use to get inventory over the past several years, I think are really going to come into play. So that would be, my best advice is there's a lot of turmoil in new, so have a tight used vehicle business.
That's great advice. Before we go, Patrick, can you tell our listeners some of the great economic information that they can find on the website, all of the stuff that you put out there every month and biannually for our listeners?
Sure, yeah. Please be sure to come by nada.org. We have information monthly on new light vehicle sales in the NADA Market Beat and ATD Truck Beat reports. Truck Beat's actually just quarterly, but Market Beat is monthly. We have information on the impact of franchise dealers in your state and our state data sheets, and we have that both for NADA and ATD. And then finally, we do NADA data twice a year, an annual report and a mid-year update. The mid-year update should be out sometime in September, and we'll give you an idea of how the average dealership performed in the first 6 months of the year. And we also do a full year update for ATD data as well. So all of those resources are on the website and they're free. And if you have any questions about any of these reports, please feel free to shoot me an email at economics@nada.org. I'll happily clarify any questions you might have or engage in some lighthearted and fun debate with you if you so choose.
Thank you so much for your insights today. It's really been great to have you on the show. And just one second, I was making gazpacho this weekend. I didn't once thinking about adding tariffs to the mix. Just want to make sure we're clear.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
That's all the time we have for this episode. A huge thank you again to our guest, Patrick Manzi, for joining us. If you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating or a review and tell a friend. Once again, I'm Michael Hayes.
And I'm Cameron Wilson. This has been Dealer Driven from NADA. Keep your dealership in drive, and we'll see you next time.